Hello, this is Chapter 9 lecture video, Mutual Help Groups and Spiritual and Religious Resources. So in this chapter lecture video, you are going to get some more insight about AA meetings, how they work, other mutual help groups that are out there, also known as self-help groups, some discussion about how spiritual and religious impacts have on addiction and recovery, and some tips for kind of engaging clients with this type of, practice or focus. So that is what you'll be covering in this chapter. I wanted to get started by kind of discussing a little bit about family. Family is, supposed to be the most influential, the most powerful resource or system that we have in our lives. However, we almost have to ask ourselves is what changes this? Like, what would make a family not be so powerful or be so influential in our lives? Some things, maybe divorce, job relocation, or decisions to maybe move away from the family, changing family expectations. So, what was once an expectation of the family may have changed over time. Extended family isn't so extended anymore. Different quarrels within the family, stuff like that could be an impact on how your family may not be so influential. Take a moment to think about your own family. This is an important part of addiction treatment is talking about the family and, whether or not you are very active with your family or not very active, but, keep in mind that a person who is struggling with addiction, they may have broken those ties with their family and they may not have that family as a support. So it is very influential and powerful for a person who is struggling with addiction, whether it be powerfully influential or negatively influential, positively influential or negatively influential. For those families who aren't a resource for people in addiction, and we do have friends, we have coworkers, or other fellow peers, stuff like that, but they may turn to mutual help groups or a spiritual religious group or focus. So that's kind of why some of these outside meetings are so important, especially for those who don't really have that familial support. Many mutual help groups also have that spiritual foundation like AA, so we're going to talk a little bit about that as well. So let's get started with mutual help groups. And I will probably reference this as self-help groups because that's kind of what I know it as. But I'm trying to reference mutual help group as that is how it is described in your textbook. So mutual help groups have developed for people with a common problem, and they are voluntary meetings. So they are, you're not court-ordered or mandated to be there. You get together to help each other with the problem, and not always connected to the healthcare system or a funding source. These are solely self-ran. They're not run by professionals or specific agencies. They could be, but they're typically not. Self-help groups are for almost any problem that you can imagine. So it could be for addiction, it could be for gambling, food, sex, anything really. There's nicotine, methadone anonymous. There's a bunch of different mutual help groups. About 5 million attend one in the United States for alcohol or drug use or addiction. And some are online now. We're moving to this online realm of things, and some of these meetings are offered online as well. So that is outreaching more people. They are at, little to no cost or very inexpensive. Sometimes you may just be asked to donate $1 or $2 for the coffee and the donuts. Some criticisms of self-help groups is that it perpetuates the disease model, abstinence is required, and attendance is mandatory. However, attendance is mandatory is kind of, it's mandatory in the sense that if you don't keep going, you're not going to get the help that you need. It's not that they're going to kick you out of the group or tell you that they're going to call a probation officer and get you in trouble in that sense. Some of this criticism comes from, 12-step models and professional treatment programs with mutual help 12-step groups in the community. So although a facility may have a 12-step model, it may not necessarily be following a 12-step group. So that kind of makes it a little bit confusing too. Alcoholics Anonymous, we have talked about before. It began in 1935 when alcoholism was considered a moral failing. and the healthcare profession considered it a progressive disease, and it was pretty hopeless for those who struggled with it. We got Bill Wilson and Bob Smith, late-stage alcoholics, took the principles from a Christian movement and wrote the Alcoholics Anonymous, the big book. So we've got this big book, and we've got these people who kind of founded the whole AA principles and foundings. 12 traditions is something else that is, very popular with, in AA. So with the 12 traditions, no alcoholic man or woman is excluded. Leaders serve and not govern. Each group is autonomous. It is not professional therapy, it is not treatment, but it is a fellowship. There are no fees, least possible amount of organization. It's attraction, not promotion. Everyone is anonymous. There are no endorsements or engagement in political or public controversies. So those are the 12 traditions that these meetings tend to go by. The 12 steps, these are also found in box 9.1 in your textbook on page 357, if you wanted to review those. So admitting we were powerless over our disease. Let me grab my textbook here and I can pull that up for you. I should have had that up. Don't have these quite memorized. I had parts of them memorized at some time, but it's been a little bit since I did addiction therapy. So 12 steps. We admitted that we were powerless over alcohol, that our lives had become unmanageable. We came to believe that a power greater than ourselves could restore us to sanity. Step 3. Made a decision to turn our will and our lives over to the care of God as we understood Him. Step 4. Made a searching and fearless moral inventory of ourselves. Step 5. Admitted to God, to ourselves, and to another human being the exact nature of our wrongs. Step 6. We're entirely ready to have God remove all of these defects of character. Step 7. Humbly asked Him to remove our shortcomings. Step 8. Made a list of all persons we had harmed and became willing to make amends to them all. Step 9. Made direct amends to such people wherever possible, except when to do so wouldn't injure them or others. Step 10. Continued to take personal inventory, and when we were wrong, promptly admitted it. Step 11. Sought through prayer and meditation to improve our conscious contact with God as we understood Him, praying only for knowledge of His will for us and the power to carry that out. Step 12. Having had a spiritual awakening as the result of these steps, we tried to carry this message to alcoholics and to practice these principles in all of our affairs. So those are the 12 steps. A few things I want to mention about that is God stands for good orderly direction when we reference the God in the 12 steps. Also in the 12 steps too, if a person is actively working on their 12 steps, they will start at step 1 and they cannot move on to the next step until they complete that first step or second step or whatever step they're on. Kind of sounds familiar, like Erik Erikson's 8 stages of development, but you're going to complete that step before you move on to the next. Typically, you will also have a sponsor that kind of helps you work through those steps. Again, not a professional therapist, but someone that has been in recovery for some time that will help you work through all of those steps. In addition to all of this, AA is spiritually based. It supports but does not require abstinence. Abstinence is for those who want it and encourages steps towards abstinence for those who are not ready. It is led by fellow alcoholics. There's no funding, no governmental regulation, no licensing, no record of attendance, and no case records kept. And in fact, sometimes AA meetings don't even like to sign slips if you need to get so many meetings for your court. Sometimes they don't like to even do that. It is voluntary. Do not focus on compliance, but encourage people to return. So again, whenever I said that, they say attendance is mandatory, it's mandatory in the sense that you got to keep coming for it to work. Compatible with harm reduction model, people stop drinking for themselves one day at a time rather than never drinking again. The only requirement is a desire to stop drinking, not success. Relapse is generally dealt with by compassion. And it is free, no dues or fees. So those are some other things to keep in mind about AA meetings. So how do they maintain its integrity? Rules of disclosure. Giving advice or disagreeing with someone is not allowed. Because again, they're only experts of their own experiences. They're not therapists, experts, are able to give legal advice or anything like that. Depending on higher status members, longer sobriety and frequent attenders, you take newcomers under their wings and you usually get a sponsor within 90 days. A sponsor is that person that's kind of like a mentor for you. Gently guide people back into line with humorous comments. So there's, lots of slogans and jargon that you will hear in AA, and that's kind of how they kind of help people get back to recovery, and, help them work on the things that they need to work on. If you don't like what is going on in AA group, you can leave and you could start your own group. So there's no mandatory, this city needs to have this many meetings or whatever. You could always pick up and start somewhere else if you don't like that particular meeting. Who attends AA meetings? 62% are male, 89% are white, highly middle-aged adults, few young and few old. 59% have received professional counseling before. Over 1/3, which is 36%, sober for more than 10 years attend these meetings. 27% have been sober for less than a year. 82% have a sponsor, and over 3/4 got one within the first 90 days. So definitely important to know. Take note of this one. This may be a quiz question. 82% have a sponsor, and over 3/4 got one in the first 90 days. AA has more than 2 million members in 160 countries. Tends to be middle-aged, more male, white population, and there are groups for all kinds of diversity in cities and groups in rural areas, but they are not diverse. So we had mentioned before that, you could have AA in the community or you could have 12-step facilitation and treatment. So we are going to talk a little bit about the 12-step groups that are provided by professional organizations rather than in the community by just fellow alcoholics. This type of model or concept began almost 20 years after AA had started in 1952 by a psychiatrist and a psychologist at Wilmer State Hospital in Minnesota. This is reference to the Minnesota model. So the text kind of just mentions that the Minnesota model was adopted by Hazelden in 1961, but it doesn't go into a history of Hazelden. So the Minnesota model is a 12-step treatment model, and it is not an AA meeting. It has integrative professional staff with recovering alcoholics who are trained to help as paraprofessionals. So it is considered treatment because they have had professional training. It has emphasized training of staff almost from the beginning. It uses a multidiscipline approach. It uses the disease model. So again, being powerless over alcohol. It does link to 12-step community groups. It does require abstinence. It does require family involvement. Client and family education on the effects of addiction. Individualized treatment plans with a time frame to complete the 12 steps, and it focuses on compliance and aftercare. Also, some things that make this different than community-based programs is they do charge fees or they do have insurance billing, and it is licensed and monitored and accredited. So you are going to have that professional piece that you don't have within the community. By 1989, 35 years later, 95% of the treatment programs in the United States base their programs on this Minnesota model that we just reviewed. So currently, 12-step therapy is the dominant treatment model in the United States, and it's used by 75% of treatment programs. And again, that goal is abstinence, not harm reduction. More and more, however, we are adding other components such as medication management and cognitive behavioral therapy, for example. 12-step treatments are first from NA. AA is totally voluntary. This type of treatment, it's an actual treatment program. I shouldn't even say this type of treatment. It is treatment. AA is led by volunteers, not professionals, who are recovering. It is incensed or regulated, it is not regulated. And it is funded by donations, not fees or insurance reimbursement. So, there are differences between the two, and both could be beneficial for a person. However, it does have some of the same principles or morals behind it, however. So some research on AA effectiveness. We ask ourselves, is this type of treatment or is this type of community help group effective? Let's ask ourselves that. Controlled studies are impossible, because no one person is in charge, attendees aren't tracked, and membership is constantly changing. So mutual help groups in the community are not able really to be kind of tracked or researched. AA does result in abstinence while attending if you attend regularly and long term. You have a sponsor and you work the steps. The longer you attend, the higher your abstinence rate is. 60 to 70% will improve drinking less or not at all while attending, and abstinence rates are twice as high for those who do attend. Some criticisms is that 50% of people tend to drop out after about 3 months of going to meetings. We don't know yet who is going to improve and who won't improve by attending the meetings. And we do not know who will join and attend and remain sober for at least a year. We do know who will join and attend and remain sober for at least a year. Those with higher consequences of drinking and those who believe in a loving God or good orderly direction. So how does AA really work? It's very simple. To be a member, you just have to want to stop drinking or have a desire to stop drinking. And the second part is you have to carry its message to alcoholics who still suffer. So promote the message to other people who may be, not quite in the same situation that you are. Maybe you have a day clean, maybe they don't have any time clean, but you're continuously carrying on that message to others. What makes it work are several kind of components to it. First being higher power. Spirituality helps you to live a meaningful life and, to stop misusing your substance. AA does not subscribe to any particular religion. Again, good orderly direction for God. The concept is that as humans are limited and we need a higher power than ourselves to help us get through these things. So whatever you believe your higher power to be, as long as you have a higher power, something greater than yourself. You could even be an atheist and, the higher power could be your AA group. If you have a higher power, you can let go of your painful life and start to make that change. Another thing that makes AA work is, its effect on the brain. What can reverse brain rewiring from substances? We have unconditional love, even for those who aren't easy to love as alcoholics. And AA embraces them. They need new members and they feel empathy for them. So they're always welcoming and they're always trying to bring new people in. When you are embraced, you feel joy, and this emotion stimulates the brain, reducing metabolism, blood pressure, heart rate, respiratory rate, and muscle tension. So you're kind of getting that pleasure experience just by embracement and support from joy and happiness. A sober self-identity. This is created through AA meetings. Formation of a new identity developed in the prefrontal cortex region comes from repeated exposure to such AA practices. If you keep going, you're kind of creating this image of yourself or this identity of yourself that you want to see yourself be because you're surrounding yourself with other people who are in recovery themselves. So you get this idea of this better concept of yourself. Another thing that is familiar or common in AA meetings is this storytelling. So storytelling is encouraged in AA meetings. If you hang around AA long enough, you will hear your story. The story kind of goes like this. There's a couple components that a story has. How I started drinking, what your downward spiral is, what hitting rock bottom felt like for you, getting to AA and starting to change, and what stable recovery, what is life like now for you. So that is what a typical AA story sounds like, and it has those areas. From, it takes on a narrative perspective. Your own reality is socially constructed. I am the same as these people. I am now what my family or others tell me I am, and I am connected to them. I had, when I worked with people both in addiction and in my previous job where I was working with sex addiction, we would have people kind of like fill out timelines or, disclose about what their life was like. I did more so timeline work in addiction, and I did disclosure stuff with the kids with sexual addiction problems, but it's getting them to kind of put their life on a timeline, on a spectrum, and say, this is where I started, this is how I got to here, and this is my story. So storytelling is kind of a good way to kind of get this stuff out there, put it out in the open, don't leave any gaps, don't leave any secrets, be honest about it, and kind of be able to move on with it. We change our reality from hopeless alcoholic to I have experienced strength and hope. Another way that AA works is powerlessness. With alcoholism, you have lost the power of choice to drink or not drink. If you start to rely on the higher power, which is like the first concept, powerlessness becomes power for you. If you are out of control with your drinking and you give up trying to pull yourself up by your bootstraps and connect with this higher power and others who have succeeded in getting sober, you're able to start gaining control again because you have that help, you have that support. You're no longer a victim. Studies find that one impact of AA is decreased depression. Maybe that's social interaction or engagement. Disease model is another way that it works. Bill Wilson, one of the co-founders, actually avoided that term because he wanted to avoid controversy about it, whether alcoholism was a medical disease or not, because it didn't really matter to him. But it helps, it works. Many in AA see it as a threefold disease concept that involves spiritual, mental, and physical factors, and it implies the unity of life. Dependence. You're becoming dependent on the meeting. A major criticism of AA, though, is it is just a substitute for alcohol. It is a crutch for it. Members attend an average of 2 meetings a week, but members often suggest that you attend 90 meetings in 90 days. Get your 90 in 90. I don't necessarily think it's a bad thing when you have a crutch because we're, especially if you're looking at the harm reduction model and we're promoting, for a period of time, you may need this medication to help you get better. Well, what is wrong with relying on a group of people to help you get better for some time? I mean, maybe you won't always have to go to those meetings, or maybe you'll enjoy going to those meetings and that will become your aftercare. So sometimes you may need a crutch. The United States cultural value on self-reliance versus AA, that connectedness. When you have AA, you feel connected. You're dependent on other people, and it helps strengthen who your identity is and not shrink your self-worth. The dependence shifts naturally as you get more stable. So you may be very dependent on this group early on, but as you start to develop who you are, you will slowly be less dependent on them, but still be going for your own personal enjoyment or engagement. Through mentoring, sponsorship, and other services, you start to believe that I am useful, I do my part, and you're not shifting your dependence to another addiction. So even though it may be a crutch on people, it's not a crutch on another addiction. Abstinence, the reality of the situation. If it means to never drink again, AA thinks that is unrealistic. Instead, they always preach 1 day at a time. Let's just stay sober for today. Let's stay 1 hour at a time, 1 minute at a time. Progress is not perfection, but it does promote controlled drinking because to AA, an alcoholic is a person who cannot control their drinking, and if they can, they are not an alcoholic. Limited control, not drinking 1 day at a time and taking out that forever word. An alcoholic is to AA not just someone who can't control drinking. They are suffering from self-centeredness, immaturity, and absence of spiritual connectedness, mental, physical, and spiritual suffering. Eliminating drinking is just the first step toward healing. So again, we're just removing one part to kind of find that better part of ourselves. Another thing that makes AA work is that, hi, my name is, I'm an alcoholic. Alcoholic is not a negative label, but it sets realities for the situation. It is a problem we all have in common, and we make sense of our experience only by admitting this. So in their eyes, they're not seeing that, you're labeling yourself as an alcoholic, but you're admitting that you have an issue with alcohol. It can be very conflicting for people when they go because not everyone likes to label themselves as an alcoholic, but in their eyes, that's not the purpose of it. It's just admitting, hey, I'm struggling. I'm an alcoholic. I have an issue, and let's move on from it. Through AA, we make a sense of an alcoholic life story as emotionally, socially, and spiritually empty. And as we develop hope for a different future, alcoholism is not a bad habit. It is a way of living that just isn't working. It's a negative coping skill or coping mechanism. AA, the stories, the support, and the higher power helps us to transform. All right, so whom does AA benefit? There is no evidence of what makes an AA personality or a person that fits this AA personality. AA serves everybody. It can, it serves women, it serves vets, Latinos, older people, Native Americans, anybody. There are no difference there are more people that are more likely to go to the meetings, but there is no discrimination against whoever attends these meetings. So AA can benefit everybody. It's just as long as you're going and you're taking in what you're getting from the program. So when we pick up in the second part of this lecture video, we're going to cover some other 12-step groups or some other mutual help groups, self-help groups. So we will cover that in our next lecture video and hopefully help you have a better understanding of that. So stay tuned. Thanks.